Hello my friends, my name is Artur and I am an Estonian soldier. The Battle of Midway is one of the biggest naval battles in the Second World War. It had a huge impact on the outcome of the war. We all know US won that battle, but what exactly happened? On this channel we have watched Montemeyer's video, a very good video. Another channel, Invicita, has also a video about Midway. Different videos equals different perspectives, so today me and you guys were gonna re-educate ourselves on the Battle of Midway. 3 new patrons of this channel, 3 golden knights who are supporting this channel with their might and power. The heroes of this channel are Chance Jorgensen, thank you for becoming a Patreon. Steven, thank you. And Mason, thank you for supporting the channel. If you want to support the channel, become a Patreon or get one of those lovely Estonian YouTuber cups.
Today we'll be covering the climactic Battle of Midway.
Oh, it looks cool.
I'll be providing the maps and visuals as usual, but we've got a special guest who will be narrating the experience. I'll let him take it away.
Hello, I'm Craig Simons. I'm the Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College. The Battle of Midway takes place in early June of 1942, and it's a critical moment because in the first 6 months of that war in the Pacific, the Japanese had been having everything their own way.
Japanese were like the Nazi Germany. First 6 months to a year, they didn't have a single loss. They just won victory after victory, and both of those nations were convinced that they are invincible. Until Nazis ran into the Soviet Union and Japan ran into USA, the sleeping dragon. Japan is supposed to be the dragon, but in this case, US is the dragon.
Philippines, of course, had fallen. They had conquered the Dutch East Indies. Things looked desperate for the Allied cause. And Midway was critical because it turned that around. It changed the momentum of the war. The Japanese plan from the beginning was to conquer the resource base they needed to get the raw materials that would keep their industrial machinery working in Japan.
We have talked about this on this channel. It's all about oil and resources. Almost every war on this planet is a war of attrition, meaning whoever can outlast and outproduce the enemy will win. Very few wars are like that you cannot outproduce or outlast your enemy, but your strategy is so good that you win very fast. But Second World War was not a war like that. Look at Nazi Germany, the Barbarossa plan. The panzers struck through the enemy lines. They were really quick at first, but in the end Soviet Union simply outproduced their robust tanks and won the war. Japan knows that it needs resources, otherwise it cannot win.
We're very low on iron and tungsten and oil in particular. So having conquered that area in the South Pacific, they wanted to set up a defensive parameter that would force the United States to fight its way across the Pacific. But to do that, they needed to get rid of the American carriers. And the Japanese plan, Yamamoto's plan in particular, was to create a strategic plan that would draw the American carriers out of Hawaii, where they could be pounced upon and sunk by the Japanese carriers in deep water where they could never be recovered. That would give the Japanese an opportunity to solidify their resource base and defy the Americans to try to fight their way back across the ocean.
So Japanese plan relies on our planes and ships are better than the American planes and ships. They knew the Americans had 4 carriers in the vicinity. They wanted to defeat those 4 carriers with their own 4 carriers, 4 against 4. They could do this plan only because they believed that their manpower and technology was better, which was not the case, simply was not the case. The plan was flawed.
The Japanese had a very complicated plan for the Battle of Midway. They divided their forces into at least 5 battle groups. One consisted of the submarines that were supposed to ambush the American carriers as they moved their way north. Another consisted of the invasion force that was to land on Midway. Another consisted of the battleships. But the critical aspect of it was the carrier group, the 4 large carriers known as the Kido Butai. That was the key, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew it, and therefore his goal was to ambush the Japanese carriers, just as it was the Japanese goal to ambush the American carriers. And what made the difference was the contribution of the American code breakers, who were able to tell Nimitz that this was likely to happen at about this time with about this many forces and a
See, without the intelligence, this battle would have come out much differently, maybe. Code breakers, the intelligence, being one step ahead of the enemy, even if it is just knowing where they would be at what time, this gives you enough information to take down the enemy. And nowadays it's all about that. US intelligence organizations are the biggest in the world. US pours tons of resources into just knowing what their enemy countries are up to. Millions of dollars. But with good cause, I think this can prevent a lot of harm done to the US, I mean. And since we are allies, I'm so glad that US has these intelligence organizations like CIA. If it looks out for the US interests, it looks out for the Estonian interests. Welcome back, my friends. We have some more orders, but we are actually quite short on them. Maybe I have enough orders for 2 to 3 videos. Let's see if you guys get enough hats to keep this competition going. I love this competition. I hope you like it also. Now I know some people left my channel for the previous video, and for you, who you stayed and who you have gotten the hats, you are truly a hero in my eyes, because this supports the channel. This makes my life possible, as does Patron, as does the Estonian YouTuber Cup. This is what I do for living, so thank you if you are supporting. We have 5 new orders, so 5 new points go to 5 new states. We have Griffin Endress. Yes, I pronounced them in Estonian, just to piss you guys off a little bit. Boston, Massachusetts. Only the 3rd for Massachusetts. Well, if we have US elections right here, let's see who... It's the competition, basically. Well, this is a competition. Let's see who wins. Maybe I should do Democrats or Republicans here. I don't know. Maybe if you order that, you should write which you are, and I'll put the points here. So we have our own little election here. Maybe that's a bad idea. We have Chris Fortner, Glenwood, Arkansas, or Arkansas, whichever you are, Arkansas. Second one for Arkansas. I'm glad the states that have little points get the points more, because of course everybody knows Arizona and Texas and California. We have some states that are not represented, and I am for the power of the people. So even the states that don't have that many points should get more points. We have Ryan Jordan, Oakland, California. Well, speaking of the big states, 12 for California, catching up to Arizona slowly. Texas is the 2nd place, Arizona is the 1st place. Arizona, keep the momentum going, Texas is gaining on you. Logan Harmon. Hayes, Kansas. 8th for Kansas. Well, Kansas is also slowly creeping up. And finally we have Tyler Kolmick, San Antonio, Texas. Texas and Arizona both have 17. They are tied. Arizona, come on. Pick up the pace, man. You can do it. This is it, my friends. We will end this one with Texas and Arizona tying in the 1st place. If you find it in your heart to be possible, go and get the hat. Go and get the cup. Thank you, my friends. Back to the video.
The most secret organization in the United States Navy in 1942 was known as Station Hypo. It was a group of rooms in the basement beneath the 11th Naval District Headquarters building on Oahu in Hawaii, and it was run by a lieutenant commander named Joe Rochefort. And their job was to get the raw data that was intercepted from the ether, radio messages from the Japanese, and attempt to winkle some pieces of useful intelligence and information out of those. Now, a lot of people are aware that the Americans had broken the Japanese code by June of 1942, but that's a bit misleading, because what we really were able to do is get just pieces of information, the occasional word, just glimpses of what might happen, and it depended heavily on the analysis by Joe Rochefort and his team as to what that meant. And they were able to tell Chester Nimitz in late May of 1942 that the Japanese seemed to be targeting Midway, that they would be coming with 4, possibly 5 aircraft carriers, that they planned to capture the island and use it as a base, perhaps as a bargaining chip in subsequent negotiations. But because Nimitz knew they were coming, he was able to organize his...
So late May, they told them they were coming in June. That leaves you half a month maybe to prepare a huge counter operation. So yeah, the Americans did not break the code. That's a huge difference, because in the Montemere's video, they broke the code. That's different. So yeah, different videos give us different information. A word here or there, you put together a sentence. As an analyst, you have to come up with what the Japanese might do, because you only have maybe 1 or 2 words of the order. You might make up the order from those 2 words. But those few words were enough to take away the surprise moment entirely, which is what the Japanese plan relied upon so heavily. Few words. Damn it.
Forces in such a way as to surprise the Japanese instead of the Japanese surprising the Americans would surprise the Japanese, and it was the code breaking that did that. Maybe the most famous story about code breaking in the Battle of Midway is that Joe Rochefort was pretty certain that he knew what the target was, that it was the atoll of Midway. And he told Chester Nimitz that, but he got pushback from Washington. The bosses, his intelligence bosses in Washington said, well, how sure are you? It could be elsewhere. It could be Samoa. It could be New Caledonia. It could be the west coast of the United States. And what Rochefort sought to do was prove to them, not to himself, because he was pretty certain, but he had to prove to them that Midway was the target. And so what he did was, by subterranean cable, tell the people at Midway to send a radio signal back to Hawaii saying, our saltwater distillers have broken down, implying that we're running out of fresh water. And then he waited. And sure enough, the Japanese intercepted that message and reported to Tokyo that Midway, AF, the symbol for Midway, was running short of water. Now, Rochefort had his smoking gun to prove that Midway was indeed the target.
What?
Knowing that the Japanese coming was critical, but it was not entirely clear what Nimitz should do about that.
Genius.
Remember that the overall strategic plan for World War II was that the Allies would focus on Germany first, in addition to which a lot of the new construction combatant ships would not become available in the Pacific until 1943. So one option for Nimitz was simply to say, well, how important is Midway after all? The carriers are far more important. I don't want to risk my scarce carriers against a superior force. I'm going to let the Japanese have Midway, and then later on, when we're stronger, we can take it back from them. But he decided not to do that. He believed that having the advance information that they were coming and knowing roughly where they would be gave him an...
It doesn't sound American to let the enemy have what you have, to just back off. US is able to fight on 2 fronts, and this was, I guess, the first time they did it. So they proved themselves to the whole world. And yeah, if I hear US in a wartime situation, it's like, I'll let them have it, we'll take it back later. Doesn't sound like the US. What sounds like the US is, bring it on. Let's see what you got. This sounds like the US.
An opportunity he didn't want to let pass. So he took his 2 available carriers and sent them up to a position, interestingly enough, called Point Luck, to wait for the Japanese arrival, and then his 3rd carrier, the Yorktown, which had come limping back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing a 10-mile oil slick behind it with serious damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea. He would patch that up quickly using scotch tape and baling wire just to hold it together long enough until it could get out to Point Luck and join those 2 carriers. So he'd have 3 carriers against the Japanese 4, but he also had the island of Midway, which is a 4th airplane platform. So in his mind, it was kind of even odds, and having advance information and his belief in the superiority of American fighting man and American pilots.
See, both sides believe that their fighters and their pilots and technology is superior. Both sides were wrong, I think, because none of the sides was massively superior. Maybe Americans were superior at one aspect and Japanese were in another. For example, Japanese Zeros were really good. They were really agile and maneuverable, more than American fighters. But I would say American aircraft carriers were better, so it evens out. None of the sides had a massive superiority advantage. Like US nowadays in wars in the Middle East, it is far superior than the enemy, than the Taliban or whatever, ISIS. It wasn't the case back then. Japan was the world superpower by military. Not equal to the US, but close.
Because the Japanese did not know that the Americans were aware of their approach, they believed that their attack on Midway Island, their air attack on Midway Island, would be the first time the Americans figured out that there was a Japanese carrier force in the vicinity. That would make the American carrier ambushed first by submarines, then by carriers, and then finished off by battleships. But of course they didn't know that the Americans were already out of Pearl Harbor and north of the island of Midway. So as Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the 4-carrier task force of the Japanese, approached Midway. He was waiting for the American carriers to come out. He did send out search planes to look for them, but didn't expect to find them because he thought he knew where they were. So he sent his planes to attack Midway. Surprisingly, there were very few planes on Midway because they had already flown out to attack Nagumo's strike force. Because the primary target of this whole operation...
But I remember in the Battle of Midway, they shot down a lot of American bombers, that's what I remember. Even if Americans knew Japanese were coming, still the Japanese were able to shoot down a lot of the bombers. And vice versa, of course.
Was to get the American carriers, Midway being the bait, not the object. The carriers were the real object. Nagumo sent only half of his airplanes off to attack Midway Island, keeping half of them back for when the American carriers showed up. Well, the Japanese planes arrived over Midway and they bombed it pretty badly, but they reported back that a second strike would be useful. So Nagumo's dilemma is, how should he manage this? Should he launch his other half airplanes immediately to bomb Midway again and then recover the first strike coming back? Or should he wait and recover the first strike coming back and then send them off again? And in the midst of trying to decide what to do about this, he got a report from one of his search airplanes that there were American surface forces to the north of him. Well, they didn't say what kind of surface forces. So the first thing Nagumo asks is...
I remember it came down to minutes and decisions. Nagumo had like a 10-minute gap to make a decision, otherwise the first wave would come back and he would have to launch the second wave before the first wave wants to land and all of that. So in the end, it was about seconds. And he had to make the right decision, because otherwise he would have to wait for the refueling and settling of the first wave again. Because you can't use the air wave. The first wave is landing and second wave is going. No, you can only land or go or lift up the planes once. You cannot like do both of those actions at the same time. You have to decide. And if the enemy is attacking, you have to attack back, and you cannot accept your planes to land, and if they run out of fuel they will have to land on the ocean and you will lose the planes. So they need to land. If you need to attack, you need to attack before they land. It's crazy. It is a mind game, really. It's like a game of chess.
Pilot is ascertain ship types. And he waited a rather critical 10 minutes for the answer to come back. Well, it's cruisers and destroyers. Okay, not too bad, no carriers. But he should have asked himself, why were cruisers and destroyers in an unusual position north of Midway Island if they weren't there to guard a carrier, which in fact they were. It was the Yorktown Carrier Group. And once he figured that out, once he knew in a subsequent report from his scout plane that there was indeed a carrier out there, now his dilemma becomes even more complicated because his planes are returning from Midway, the first strike group. He's got the second strike group that has been armed with fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway, and what he needs to attack carriers are armor-piercing weapons. So does he take one kind of weapon off and put it on the plane? Does he wait and recover those planes? And the third problem is his combat air patrol, his fighter planes that have been protecting the task force, they're getting low on fuel. They need to land. And Nagumo made a critical decision. And this is what it was. Rather than go off half-cocked and send off some now and some later, Japanese doctrine compelled him to hit them with the biggest hammer he had. And that meant recovering the planes returning from Midway, refueling.
Yeah, all of our Japanese aggressive tactics were hit the enemy as hard as you can so they couldn't recover. Because if US could recover and hit back, Japanese would lose. They need to hit as hard as possible. Because they knew it's about time, about attrition, who has the more resources in the longer span of time. Japanese attack needed to be as big as possible. Whereas the US could allow themselves to just hit here, hit there. They knew they had the resources to play the long game, which Japanese didn't.
Rearming them with armor-piercing ammunition and then sending everything off, the torpedo planes, the bombers, the fighters, all in a coordinated strike to get those American carriers. But making the decision and making the changeover took enough time so that by the moment they were ready, it was already too late. All this time while Nagumo was making up his mind about how to respond to the news that there was an American carrier north of him, he was under attack from the land-based planes that the Americans had sent out from Midway Island, a total of 90 of them, various types of Vindicator bombers and some new Avengers and all sorts of...
Most of which were shot down, actually. Japanese Zeros did a very good job shooting down those bombers. This is a very big victory of this battle, but it remains the only one.
Very eclectic attack group, and they were not very effective, to be perfectly candid. That very few of them could get close enough to launch their torpedoes. The bombs missed by hundreds of yards. The Japanese Zeros shot down most of them. But what it did mean was that his task force had to maneuver and navigate and change direction to avoid torpedoes and try to avoid those bombs. They did all that successfully, but it delayed the transformation of the attack group from land-based fragmentation bombs to carrier-targeted armor-piercing bombs.
And time was the most precious thing back then. It was about minutes until the next wave comes and you need to do it all in between. And he had to defend himself. He couldn't get ready for the next attack. So this is what the Americans accomplished with losing so many bombers, was they kept the Japanese busy until the carrier groups can attack. Because this was only a few waves from Midway, not the carriers.
And again, that delay played a crucial role.
Yeah, now the carrier attack is coming.
There are three kinds of airplanes on every carrier. There are dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter planes. The fighter planes exist to protect the bombers and the torpedo planes from enemy fighters. But the hammer is the dive bomber, which comes streaking down from 20,000 feet at about a 70-degree angle, using the airplane itself as an aiming device, and then releasing their bomb when they're about 2,000 feet up. 1,500 feet, depending on how daring the pilot wants to be.
That is quite close, 1,500 feet. Divided by 3, you get the meters. Whew! That's, yeah, making it close. And if a plane comes this close to your ship, you can really hit it very good with your flak guns, yeah.
And then pulling out of the dive. The torpedo bombers have to come in very low, only about 100 feet off the surface, because if you drop your torpedo from too great a height, it'll break up upon entering the water. So they came in low and they came in slow. So the torpedo bombers are the slowest of the American airplanes, and yet at Midway, curiously, it was the torpedo bombers that arrived first. And there's several reasons for that.
How?
The three American carriers were operating in two groups. One group of two that would ordinarily have been commanded by William Halsey, but Halsey had a terrible skin disease and had been ordered into the hospital. So his subordinate, Admiral Raymond Spruance, who was not ordinarily a carrier commander, he was a cruiser-destroyer man, but he was in charge of that two-carrier group. The overall American commander was Frank Jack Fletcher, who was with the Yorktown group. And because they were maneuvering independently to launch and recover, carriers have to turn into the wind to do either of those things. Those two groups became further and further separated during the morning, so that when they dispatched their attack squadrons, they flew independently to the target. The most controversial...
Such a small thing. You have to turn a little bit to launch your planes, and every time you do that, you turn a little bit away from your other group. Such a small thing plays a huge role if your planes are first to the enemy, and if they're torpedo bombers, Zeros can make quick work out of them. Fighters need to be first there, so they can fight their way through Zeros. Such a small thing plays a huge role, because torpedo bombers were the ones to take down a few carriers. So if you lose them, you lose the chance.
The aspect of this was the airplane group from the Hornet, which went completely in the wrong way, heading west, probably because Admiral Select, Pete Mitcher, believed that two of the Japanese carriers were operating 80 to 100 miles behind the other two. He was incorrect in that, but he didn't want them to get away and sent his air group to attack that non-existent carrier group, so they flew themselves right out of the battle. In the lore of the history of the Battle of Midway, this is known as the flight to nowhere. None of those planes dropped a bomb or a torpedo in anger and returned with all their ordnance already still on the plane. The first torpedo squadron, Torpedo 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Jack Waldron, arrived first because he broke away from his flight group and independently flew to where he was convinced the Japanese carriers would be,
Nice.
And he was right.
ignoring the task, basically. This is a very dangerous thing to do in the military. You either get court-martialed or you will become a hero. And he did the right decision.
But he arrived there without any supporting fighters or any cooperating bombers. So his 15 planes went in unassisted. They made no hits whatsoever. And then soon afterward, the torpedo bombing squadrons from the other two carriers also arrived, and they made no hits. And all of those torpedo planes were savaged by the Japanese Zeros. Oof. The advantage for the Americans, and it's hard to find a silver lining here, but if there is one, here it is. And that is that the Japanese fighters came down to their altitude, about 1,000 feet, 500 feet, in order to shoot down all those torpedo planes, which meant that when the American dive bombers arrived at 20,000 feet, 10 or 15 minutes later, there were no Japanese Zeros to harass them as they lined up for their dive attack. But the other...
So torpedo bombers down here, dive bombers 20,000 feet so high up. Zeros are down here, they cannot take down planes that are so high up. Back then it takes some time to gain altitude. Again, such a small thing. And yes, Zeros did a very good job defending their carriers. The carriers did a very good job avoiding the bombs. Japanese luck was incredible back here. 3 waves of bombers, not a single hit. All the bombers destroyed. Full out victory to the Japanese to this point. But things will change. Their luck will run out.
The other carrier, the Enterprise, was the critical group. It flew directly toward the coordinates that had been calculated that morning, but they only found empty ocean there because the Japanese had turned north at 9:17 that morning, and the commander, Wade McCluskey, did not know that. But even though he was already low on fuel, he began a box search, and in the process of that search, he saw one ship, a Japanese destroyer, speeding northward at 33 knots, leaving a bright white fantail behind it. And he used that as a guide to direct him to where he thought the Japanese carriers must be, and he was right. And he arrived over the Japanese carriers at about 10:20 in the morning, just after the Japanese fighters had shot down all those American torpedo planes.
So it's weird, all of the Americans' waves go to different positions, but that means they arrive at different times. Keep harassing Japanese always, minute by minute, not like a huge one wave the Japanese can fight off, but many consequent waves coming in from different angles. Zeros have to do so much work, they're low on fuel. They harass the Japanese so much that finally, if they needed to reload the tanks of the Zeros or land some planes or lift some planes, they didn't have a chance to do that because they were always harassed. They always needed to protect themselves. Never a moment to breathe, never a moment to strike back. So the Americans played a very aggressive hand here, and it paid off.
You could not have figured this out better if you had planned it, but it wasn't planned. It was inadvertent and it was accidental.
Perfect.
So when McCluskey arrives over the Japanese carrier force, he can see 3 of them in his immediate view. There are 2 steaming more or less together, one a little further off to the right, and then one just out in the distance on the horizon. So he's going to target the first 2 he comes to, and he gives orders for one of his 2 squadrons to attack the carrier on the left and one to attack the carrier on the right. But that information never got past airplane to airplane, and the result of that was that 27 of the 30 airplanes all dove on the same carrier.
27!
The Kaga, the biggest of the Japanese carriers, built on the hull of a battleship, a gigantic 40,000-ton aircraft carrier. Bad thing about that is that the other carrier, the Akagi, which was actually a Japanese flagship, would not have been attacked at all had not Lieutenant Richard Best recognized what was happening, signaled his 2 wingmen to stay with him, and peeled out from that squadron, and those 3 lone airplanes went after the Akagi. Ordinarily, 3 airplanes would not have been enough. But they were this time for very specific reasons. One, Richard Best landed his 1,000-pound bomb square in the middle of the flight deck of the Akagi.
Woo!
It penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck. And that was important because it was on the hangar deck that all the Japanese planes were being refueled, had taken off one kind of ordnance and stacked it to one side and were bringing up another kind of ordnance and putting that on the airplane. So here are bombs and torpedoes and aviation fuel aplenty on the Japanese hangar deck. And when
this is pure luck. You need 20 planes to take out one ship. You only have 3. You hit it in the middle and you get the Japanese refueling, so all of the flammables are ready to be burst into flames, you know? American luck. Japanese luck just ran out.
When Best's bomb exploded, it set off a series of subsequent concussions that ended up sinking the Akagi. So both the Kaga and the Akagi were lost due to the dive bombing squadron from the USS Enterprise.
Damn.
The third Japanese carrier, the Soryu, watching this, the sailors horrified to see these two ships burning so badly, were under attack simultaneously from the dive bombers from the Yorktown.
See, the squadrons, the American waves attack so strongly and aggressively that the other 2 carriers cannot help at all, because they need to defend against the previous waves of American bombers. Wave after wave from different angles. You cannot do anything. You cannot help the other carriers because you're always busy defending. This is what they accomplished.
Frank Jack Fletcher's carrier. And again, they arrived at about the same time, not because it was a coordinated plan, but because McCluskey had gone too far south and had to rotate to get north. But the Yorktown pilots, who launched later, went directly to the target, so they arrived simultaneously. That meant that the Soryu too was hit by several bombs and within minutes was burning. And the consequence of all this is that between about 10:25 and 10:29, on the morning of June 4th, 1942, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded by dive bombers from the American carriers.
Oh my God. Get the taste of
The Japanese
freedom.
were no doubt depressed by the fact that they lost 3 carriers in about a 5-minute period, but they immediately launched a counterattack. The Japanese mind was focused on offensive action, and so they launched an attack against the carrier that they could find, which was Fletcher's Yorktown. The attack by the dive bombers was pretty effective. It did some serious damage. The Yorktown was smoking and burning when the Japanese pilots returned to their carrier, and they reported that they had sunk an American carrier. Well, they had not. They had damaged it badly, but the damage control teams on the Yorktown patched the holes, got the engines working, and within an hour, the Yorktown was steaming again at sufficient speeds to launch and recover aircraft.
What?
So that when the second attack of the Japanese came, torpedo planes, they found a fully operational carrier underway. Thinking that one had already been sunk, they attacked that one, put 2 torpedoes into it. Again, more damage to the poor Yorktown. It had been hit in the Battle of the Coral Sea. It had been hit by the dive bombers. Now was hit by torpedo bombers. It proved to be pretty much too much. And the captain had to order abandon ship. Later on, he would try to recover that ship. But it matters to the Japanese because those pilots went back and said, we've sunk 2 American aircraft carriers. Well, they hadn't. They hadn't even sunk one yet, although the Yorktown would eventually go down. But that led them to believe...
Jump to conclusions too early. Well, if you see 3 of your aircraft carriers going down, you need that good news, even if it's not true. I would say it to be true. I understand the Japanese mindset. They were to lose the whole war right there. They needed something to hold on to. So we sunk another carrier was that they hold on to. They made up the good news, basically.
Believe it might be possible to continue the battle even though they lost 3 of their carriers. That afternoon, the Americans launch another attack. The planes come back, they're refueled, rearmed, and sent out again to find the 4th Japanese carrier. That's the Hiryu. And they do. And again, bombs land square on the flight deck. The whole forward part of the ship is just dug out like a giant ice cream scoop. Had taken out the forepart of the ship. It's clearly fatal damage to the Hiryu, and eventually it would go down, though the Americans don't learn about that until well after the battle is over. In fact, the fact that the Battle of Midway was as decisive as it was does not become clear for several days and even weeks. Yamamoto, who's in charge of this whole thing, whose plan all this had been, is riding the giant Japanese battleship Yamato, several hundred miles behind the carrier force. The Japanese idea being that after the carrier battle, the battleships would come in and clean up whatever wrecked America.
clean up, well now they are to be cleaned up by American carriers. And yes, the whole plan relied on the surprisal moment, which they didn't have, and the superiority of Japanese technology and pilots, which was also false. So the whole Japanese aggressive plan relied on two very faulty perimeters. Japanese just made huge mistakes here, that's what they lost.
American ships were still afloat. So he's not there to witness this, and he gets the report first that 2 carriers have been sunk, and then that a 3rd carrier has been sunk, and then that a 4th carrier has been damaged. And even then he plays with the idea of trying to continue this. At night, if they can get close enough with their big battleships, maybe they can still snatch victory from defeat. But when the 4th carrier is lost, he realizes the game is up. And he finally gives the order to turn around and head back to Japan.
Bye-bye.
Raymond Spruance is in charge of the 2 carrier group that would have been Bill Halsey's under ordinary circumstances. But because they were operating separately, Fletcher, whose Yorktown ship had now been mortally wounded, turned over to Spruance the tactical command of the force that's left, and Spruance sent out yet another strike trying to find some of the supporting Japanese ships. They find 2 heavy carriers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, attack both of those, pretty much destroy them as well. So in addition to the 4 carriers, it's 2 heavy cruisers, and of course a lot of important Japanese pilots, which are going to be irrecoverable for the Japanese.
It's all about the pilots also, of course. If we're talking about experience in the air, then you can, 5 newbie pilots equals 1 ace, basically. If 1 ace can do a lot of damage and newbie pilots cannot do anything. So it's all about the experience you have. And Japan lost almost all of its experienced pilots right now.
Japanese. But here's another thing that Spruance does that's interesting. When night falls, instead of continuing the pursuit, which some of his subordinates urged, he turned around and headed back toward Hawaii. The reason being he knew the Japanese might be seeking a night engagement, and he wanted absolutely no part of that. And he was cool enough in his decision making that having made that decision, pretty sure that he had done the right thing, he went to bed. The Battle of Midway does not decide the outcome of the war, but it
does. For me it does. The whole idea of Japanese victory lies in punching the Americans so bad that they are afraid and run away. They couldn't do that in Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea or Midway. Now they're just retreating. Yes, it would be a very bloody battle, but they won't have a chance to attack anymore, just defend. So it is the outcome of the war.
Dramatically changes the trajectory of the war. In the first 6 months of that conflict, the Japanese were on the offensive. They were the aggressors. They made the decisions about what would be attacked and when, and the Americans were responding to that aggression. After the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese were on the defensive, trying to protect what they had, and the Americans would go on the offensive. In fact, just a month later, they would land on the island of Guadalcanal to begin the offensive that would cross the Pacific and end in Tokyo Harbor in 1945.
What an incredible story, incredible video, and incredible feats of action from Japanese and American pilots. Of course, luck played a huge role here. Japanese had very much luck at the beginning, and Americans had a lot of luck. Both. It's not just about a strategy, it's about luck, stupid decisions, underestimating your enemy, overestimating your own force, all of that. So interesting. Hey, if I find another video about this, I will do it. I don't care that I've done it so much. I love this topic. I hope you do also. If you like these videos and you like to learn history with me, I'm learning this with you right now, then support the channel. Become a patron and get the Estonian YouTuber cup. And as always, my friends, until my next video, stay cool and bye bye.